right, looks like it's started. Hey guys, I'm Jacob Stokes, content marketing specialist and managerial editor at Practical 365. I'm going to be kicking things off today. Thanks again for everyone for joining this Tech Talk, Controlling the Control Plane, Defining Gaps in Tier 0 to Shut Down Attack Paths with Justin Kohler. A few housekeeping items before we get started. This session is being recorded, so please use the chat to ask questions. Justin did say that he'll, answer them on the fly, so no worries there. We also have Quest sales engineers Fuad Hamdi and Rich Hansen, and they're going to be answering questions in the chat as well if Justin is busy. And we'll be adding in some helpful links to blogs and other related content during this session. But I don't want to take much more of your time up. I'm going to pass this on to Justin to jump into his session.
Well, hello, everybody. This is a talk I gave at the Experts Conference this year in September in Atlanta. It was a great event. We'll obviously be talking about the 2024 event at the end of this presentation and showing you how to sign up for that later. But I just want to comment that this was a super fun event. Again, a talk that I gave there, really active conversation. I personally love an active conversation. So if you do have questions, particularly if they're relevant to what I'm talking about at the time, just pop them in and I'll try to answer them as I go. So this is a talk about controlling the control plane, or the Tier 0 area of Active Directory and Azure. This is taking parts of multiple presentations and talks and showing kind of some basics of how some of the Tier 0 isolation can break down in very simple ways, and as well as giving some background in Tier 0 in general. So why should you listen to me? So I lead the Bloodhound team at SpecterOps. If you're familiar with Bloodhound, Bloodhound was a open source tool that was created in 2016 to help penetration testers attack Active Directory and find attack paths. This is a tool that we wrote and still maintain to this day, and it allows us to visualize relationships in Active Directory and to view it kind of like a map. SpecterOps in general is a leader in adversary emulation services and research. So we specialize in pen testing, red teaming, and detection services. We do a lot of training around that as well. We have over 90 open source tools, so you might be familiar with some of these, like Empire Certify, Mythic, Ghostwriter, Bloodhound being another one, etc. We like to say if you haven't interacted with us personally on a pen test or a red team engagement, you probably have interacted with a team that has used one of our tools. So we launched Bloodhound Enterprise in 2021. This was taking the original concept of Bloodhound and flipping it on its head and trying to give powers back to the defender to shut down attack paths at scale. So we've seen a lot of environments. So before we get started, let's acknowledge some prior work. So going back several years to a talk that Rohan Berserker and Andy Robbins and Will Schroeder did around the unexplored land of Active Directory ACLs. You can find that link there. We were doing a series on what is Tier 0. So Tier 0, and I'll kind of brush on this in this talk, is let's say an ever-evolving concept. And it's helpful to understand where the boundary of Tier 0 starts and stops in your environment, so you can make informed decisions on where you might be able to shut down extra or delegated permissions that threaten that isolation of Tier 0. So there was also a talk earlier this year at Troopers for identifying further ACL attack paths and an OU structure to tackle some of that risk. That again was done by Jonas, who's on our team, and then Alexander Schmidt, who's a partner out of Germany. There's an ace up the sleeve. This is a huge white paper that we've done previously on just Active Directory ACL backdoors. And then finally, adsecurity.org and the entire team at Trimark and Sean Metcalf. They can't understate or overstate how much those guys have done for Active Directory security at large. So what are we going to talk about today? The history of secure enterprise access and where Tier 0 or the concept of Tier 0 comes from. The unclear understanding of tier zero as we have seen it, and the gaps that that creates. Just understanding where that barrier or that boundary does or does not apply, and then again how attackers can abuse it, and then how you can stop them. So again, we're going to talk about some three fairly basic problems with tiering isolation and some attack paths that kind of form. They'll start pretty basic and then move into more advanced, and just kind of give you a preview of things that you might be able to shut down in your directory. So let's talk about the secure history of secure enterprise access. So again, we kind of touched on this in an earlier talk earlier this year when we introduced the series, What is Tier Zero? And you can go back and find those webinars as well. But starting from the beginning, we have Active Directory's launch in 1999. We had shortly thereafter this concept introduced called least privilege. So, there's this Venn diagram of the user's role, policy, and the available tasks, and you only want to give them, the least amount of privilege to do all three. In 2007, we get the, by the way, what I'm showing you here is the top is the what has been introduced in terms of the directories or the best practices that we've learned along the way. And on the bottom is the kind of attacker, let's say, answer to all of that. So in 2007, we get the Pass the Hash toolkit by Core Security. In 2008, the Azure launch takes place. And in 2009, there's a really important white paper out of Microsoft called Heat Ray. And this is kind of responding to some of the stuff that's happened with the Pass the Hash toolkit work. In this white paper, John Dunnigan, Alex Zhang, and Alice Zhang and Daniel Simon talk about this concept of moving through the directory and introduce this concept of what they call an identity snowball attack. This was the very first implication of an attack graph, or again, moving or a map of the directory. And what that did was really kind of try to depict the story behind a situation like this, where we have a user that might be phished initially. They have some privilege, and then it just connects and connects and connects. So the story that you might read in terms of an incident write-up or some debrief of an attack, instead of looking at it like a story that seems may or may not be connected, we can kind of graph that out. So all of that same story that I read word for word, you have David, which is a member of a help desk, which is a member of tier 2 support, which has admin rights on a computer in the directory. That computer has a logon session for some other user, and then that user has some right over to domain admins group. So this is what Alice and Daniel and John were talking about in terms of an identity snowball attack, how you can move through the directory and go from user to machine to user to machine, and so on and so forth. So can't understate the importance of that, or can't overstate the importance of that early research. That's followed very shortly by the drop of Mimikatz in 2011. That makes it very easy to carve credentials out of memory and replay those. Finally, in 2012, we get a little bit more clarity on how you should organize your directory to prevent against this privileged user attack scenario that we're seeing out of the Pass the Hash toolkit and Mimikatz responder. We were only dealing with this least privilege, and it's really hard to that's not very specific. Tiered administration tried to make this a little bit more specific, but note that that's 13 years after Active Directory originally got released. So you can imagine all of the work that admins have been doing over those 13 years. Now they finally get this way of trying to organize and segment privilege. But how much work do they have to undo in their directories, or how heavy-handed is this going to be? Now, regardless of how difficult it is going to be, it is very effective. So what you're trying to do is make sure, again, that like domain admins don't log into lower privileged users. And that's the whole concept. We can go far in depth in what tiered administration is, but, we're trying to prevent that kind of pass the hash or escalating privileges in Active Directory. In 2014, I tried to get more specific with the red forest model. This is like the heaviest hammer to try to shut down these paths. At the same time, we also get the Kerberos attack. But the red forest model is we've only ever seen, I will say from the SpectraOps side, we've only seen a couple organizations ever deploy this and actually maintain it successfully. It can be very effective, but it is an extremely heavy-handed response, and it can be quite difficult to maintain. Just administrative overhead is pretty intense. Then in 2016, we again released the Bloodhound project. In 2018, we get Microburst that is doing basically the same kind of attack graph in Azure. Oh, I'm sorry, that was Storm Spotter. My apologies. But we see this explosion of tools in Azure, and at the same time, we now get the new secure enterprise access model called the enterprise access model. So this is the evolution, based from least privilege to tiered administration to red forest to enterprise access. So this is the model that we have today. This again is the evolution of the tiered administration red forest model. This now accounts for things like hybrid environments. They try to incorporate the zero trust principles. And they introduce these concepts of the control plane, privileged access, management plane. It's important if you're used to the legacy tiering model. It's basically just shifting terms. So tier 0 becomes the control plane, tier 1 splits a little bit, and tier 2 splits a little bit. But it's essentially the same thing. So if you're familiar with the tiered administration, you're focused around tier 0, just understand that moves to control plane and the privileged access tier. And it's really not that much different. So we talked about how privileged access or tier 0 becomes privileged access. I personally think that tier 0 is more understood. So when I talk about this concept of securing like the most privileged identities, if I say privileged access, a lot of people look at me kind of funny. If I say tier 0, they're like, "Yep, we totally understand what you mean." So I think the industry, it's kind of like the shift from Azure AD to Entra ID. Like how long will that take for the entire industry to kind of grasp on and documentation to reflect? For now, we personally, like on the SpectraOps side, use the term tier 0 because more people are familiar with it. So I'm going to stick with tier 0 for the rest of this presentation, but understand that they're the same. So why do we talk about the enterprise access model? Well, when we think of attack paths or that really important research on the Microsoft side, starting from heat ray and kind of the things that we model in Bloodhound, well, an attack path is just a violation of these secure access models. So starting, again, with least privilege into tiered administration and into the enterprise access model, what we're talking about is those boundaries that cross those planes, both within the plane, but more importantly, when you escalate privilege from like the management plane to the privileged access tier, for example. So that's kind of the history on, where did the term tier 0 come from, and what do we use today with the enterprise access model? Again, understanding that I'm going to use tier 0 for the remainder of this presentation. So it's important to understand, if the most sensitive principles in the enterprise access model is that tier 0 or privileged access tier, we really need to be very clear on what meets the definition of tier 0. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's a series of webinars that we put on at SpectraOps just all around tier 0. So we've done 2 at this point. We will do a 3rd in the spring. And so again, just reflecting on, we've done an entire 2 hours up to this point just on defining tier 0. It's really important to understand kind of the barriers of tier zero, because, if you leave something out, again, are you exposing something by accident? So starting first with Microsoft's tier zero definition, this is there. I'm not going to read it verbatim, but note that they talk about the direct control of enterprise identities in your environment. And really importantly, they also include this concept of direct or indirect control. That's really important. I will talk about that later in slides. It's also important that they talk about control over one may have control over another. So let me explain this. A domain admin is understood to have control over a domain controller. A domain controller houses all the password hashes of domain admins. You're never going to change that, so don't try. Basically, you don't really need to concern yourself too much with try to segmenting one tier zero user away from another tier zero principal. But what you want to make absolute sure of is that boundary between tier zero and tier one is well defined, so that you're avoiding those escalation paths. So direct versus indirect control. So direct control is like an explicit right. I, as a user in Active Directory, have the add member privilege over this group. So I can add a member to that group. That's an ACE that's directly applied to my user object. Indirect means how could I essentially abuse my way to get there? So this is an example is presented at the bottom where you have the direct right of tier 2 support has direct admin rights over payment, which this is a machine in the environment. And then there's an indirect control relationship that computer has over the domain admins group. And this indirect path is completed by this service pay admin account having a user session on this machine, which is abusable. And then that service account has the add member right. So again, think of it. I have direct rights over some group. This is how I could abuse my way to get to that. Therefore, it's an indirect control right. You can also understand this is transitive control. So if A controls B, B controls C, then therefore A controls C. I won't go too in depth on this because, again, we've done 2 webinars just on defining tier zero. But one thing that we've taken away with is a better or a more clear explanation of what is tier zero. And we just stipulate that tier zero is a set of assets in control of enterprise identities and their security dependencies, period. So when we look at the Microsoft's tier zero list, this is from their documentation, which is linked below. They have a bunch of different principles in Active Directory that they call out as tier zero. Note that when you get further down this list, it gets very broad. So, members like under, I'm not going to read all of this verbatim, but you start first with enterprise admin, which is pretty easy to understand, go down to domain, yada, yada, yada. Then you get to other delegated groups, right? Custom groups, and then local administrators for underlying operating system of systems that, belong to tier zero. And I'll explain that further later. One thing that we have identified in our webinars is that we actually disagree with the concept of read-only domain controllers and group policy creator owners as tier zero principles. I won't go into detail on why. Again, you should watch those webinars to figure out how we justify that position. But this is an ongoing conversation, and if you're interested in joining those, again, watch the first 2. We're going to have another one in the spring. There's an output of those discussions. We're putting up a tier zero kind of table in GitHub that people can contribute to. And it's just a running list of, the unique identifier, where they live, are they protected by admin SD holder if they're a Active Directory. Heather asked, can we have a link to those sessions for the tier zero webinars? Yes, I will get that to you by the end of the presentation. If not, we'll follow up later. But this full list is being constantly updated and maintained. If you're interested, it is located here. And if you have contributions, we've gotten a lot of really good feedback from the community, including some additions. And it's just an active conversation. We realize that we don't know everything there is to know about Active Directory or Azure. Nobody can. So, but we do want to have some source of truth for what people can use to define this kind of critical boundary for their environments. So we talked about the default list of tier 0 principals. So again, enterprise admins, domain controllers, and then it kind of gets more broad as you continue. There are other there's other members of tier 0 that are dependent on what you are running within your environment. So again, Microsoft kind of references this here, other delegated groups, custom groups that may be created in your organization to manage directory operations. An example of that might be Azure Connect servers or group policy administration tools such as Quest GPO admin. So these are custom things that are not default to Active Directory, but have been created and must have rights over the identity infrastructure within the directory, and you cannot change that. So these are 5 different examples of if you are running these in your environment, these are no debate tier 0. So PKI, ADCS, ADFS, Azure AD Connect servers and accounts, and I'll talk about a specific example with that later on in the presentation. Privileged access management systems, so if those are housing the credentials of your privileged access or tier 0 principals, those should absolutely be considered tier 0. And then again, the GPO administration tools. So why all this emphasis on tier 0 and defining these principles? Like why are we talking about this? Well, we've established that tiering, or the concept first starting with least privilege and then all the way through enterprise access is a recommended best practice. And I think nobody in security or in IT would disagree that you should only give the minimum rights to a user or principal that they require to do their job. We've also kind of talked, at least initially, about how the concept around tier 0 kind of gets vague after you get away from enterprise admins, and domain controllers, and then there's some debate on how deep you go after that. And it can also be dependent on your environment, right? If you're running ADFS or Azure. If you don't have a very good understanding of where that boundary is within your environment, you can inadvertently introduce gaps. And I'll talk about 3 very specific examples that we've seen where these gaps arise. And starting from the most basic, group nesting, to a little bit more advanced, inheriting privilege through ACEs, these are 3 different ways where just not being very clear on where your tier 0 boundary exists can, again, allow me as an adversary to attack your environment. So let's start with group nesting. So group nesting, this is if you have the domain admins group and you put a random group under the domain admins group through security group delegation, everybody in that random group is now a domain admin. Too many words, but long story short, you put anybody under another group and they hold all the power of that top level group. And I'm sure that some people on this webinar are like, are we really talking about this? Yes, and here's why. This is what group nesting we see in the field. So this is a picture of a tier 0 group environment where you can see all of these nesting of different groups. And it's just recommended practice that you should never nest things under a tier 0 group like domain admins, backup operators, yada, yada, yada. When you do this, again, you just blow up the amount of principles that you have to account for and protect. And so I'll give you 3 more examples of group nesting that we have seen. So here is one. So this is fairly bad, and these will get worse. We have this one was they had a local admin app servers that was nested under administrators. They were trying. This was a tier 1 group, and they had actually nested it under a tier 0 group inadvertently. Um, that's bad, but they have some idea of segmentation, and they just violated it here. Here's a little bit worse. So this is where you see a couple different tiers. You see tier 1, tier 2, and even desktop admins. And long story short, they're all nested under administrators. And then at the worst example is you put the domain users group under administrators. And I will tell you, this was a very quick call that we were on. We deployed and saw this, and we're like, okay, there's literally no point in talking about any other attack path in the environment. You need to remove the domain users group from administrators. And again, I'm sure that people are chuckling on this. But what we have seen is if the ability for an administrator to, if the ability exists for an administrator to make a change, somebody will. And that's why we were talking about it. Okay, so group nesting. Again, this is just understand the tier 0 groups that exist within your environment. Start with Microsoft's definition, start with our definition. It doesn't matter. And understand if you're just nesting groups for every domain that exists within your environment in every forest. Because again, you could be vastly increasing the amount of tier 0 users just for something simple as nesting. Okay, privilege logons. So interactive user logons, this was, again, kind of originally talked about back in 2009 with the heat ray and the identity snowball attack. This is the concept of if a user logs into a machine and I have access to that machine, then I can abuse that logon event in multiple ways to then take over that account. So the most probably the most popular one is dumping the password from LSAS. But there are multiple ways you can abuse this. I'm not going to talk about every one, but it's important to note that you just having a vaulted credential or short token times that might be enforced by another complementing control isn't a silver bullet for this problem. I can't talk enough about how great privileged access management tools are, but it doesn't solve this residual risk. If you log into a machine that an attacker has access to, it's kind of game over. We can abuse that in multiple ways. And so the important thing is to understand where privileged users are logging in and shutting that down if it's not in a tier 0 asset. So again, the concept introduced in the tiered administration model is domain admins or those equivalent should only be logging in to domain controllers. And if you're logging into, like, let's say servers or tier 1 servers, you should have a different account that's used for that, those login events. Because again, you don't want somebody to take control over that domain admin logging into a tier 1 or tier 2 machine, and then all of a sudden I'm a domain admin. So these are examples of that in the wild. On the left is a picture of a domain admin account that was used to upgrade servers in the fleet. All the red dots you see there are computer objects in a directory, and all the green dots are users. And you can see that one specific domain admin over here has been using their credentials basically to upgrade a bunch of things in the environment. During that upgrade process, that account was actually executing what's called an interactive logon on those machines. That was leaving that credential material open for abuse. And again, not just the credential, we could abuse the logon session or the logon token, inject into a process, you name it, that's started by the user. On the right side, this was actually a commercial or an enterprise backup service. So same thing here again. So on the red dots are computers, and the green dot in the center right there is a user object. This was actually a service account that was being used by a backup software. No, I'm not going to name what backup software because they have admittedly this was a legacy configuration that was done, years ago. They have a newer version of doing this configuration through an agent. So it's not actually, logging on, but it's executing the work through an agent, which removes this attack surface. So there's no longer a bunch of interactive logon events. But this, when we found this out, it was pretty bad. You're doing backups, you're trying to do the right thing, but it's just doing it in a way that's actually introducing, I would argue, more risk than potentially taking the backup in the first place. And that was a domain admin account. Kind of a fun fact. When we looked at these two pictures, we used these internally as examples. We think they look at like famous spaceships. So yeah, we find entertainment in the weird ways, I guess. Inherited privileges. So we talked about group nesting, talked about login events. The most, I guess the most complicated scenario for this webinar is inheriting privileges through ACEs, but this is by no means the most complicated scenario. This is basically scratching the surface of 3 specific ways, again, that you can violate tier 0 inadvertently. So privileges or access control entries. This is a picture from ADUC of an access control entry. So each line here is an access control entry. Call attention to this one. This one is saying allowed authenticated users special control over this object. So what I'm trying to call attention to here is what does special mean? You as an administrator or security professional, like, I don't know. I don't know what special means. If you wanted to get more information on what special means, you need to hit modify in ADUC, and then you get a series of menus that looks like this. And your eyes are going to start bleeding because who can decipher what this means? All of these different checkboxes. Do you understand which one of which privileges that might be checked could be abusable? Maybe they're read writes, maybe that in itself is bad, but which one gives them permissions to actually modify the object and maybe escalate to where they could take over the object? It's not obvious. And I'll also say that it's even more frustrating that this list isn't even all the privileges that exist. You actually have to go lower level. ADUC doesn't show you everything. You have to go lower level to get the full source of truth, and then you're like interacting in SDDL format, and it gets super complex super fast. ACEs create attack paths. We talked about I mentioned earlier, like if I have direct rights over, like the direct right to add a member to a group, then that's an ACE that could be an attack path. So if somebody takes over my account, they can then add a person to another group that I have that direct right over. This is an example of an attack path using ACEs. So Andy is a member of the help desk admins, which has an ACE to add member to the server admins, and then has full control over this machine on the right. Here's some examples of some particularly sensitive ACEs that can be set on objects and what you can do for them. I won't read these word by word, but starting with change the password to full control, to even just something as benign reading as write DACL or write owner. You might not, or generic, right? You might not think initially that that's as sensitive as full control or force change password. Those seem like they would be abusable, but what would I do with right owner privileges? Any of these can be used to take over the target object, and there's documentation. We've documented each of these abusable ACEs on the Bloodhound side. If you're familiar, we can drop that, or if you're curious, we can drop that link here at the end of the presentation as well. So why do we talk about ACEs? So very common thing that we see that violates or threatens tier 0 objects is when you have non-default tier 0 objects that are not protected by an admin nesty holder. So ACEs are often inherited, right? And so that doesn't apply to things like It usually doesn't apply to things like the domain admins group, because domain admins is protected by admin SD holder. But consider the following scenario. So we create a setup for Azure Active Directory sync. In the setup of that, there's a service account and a computer object that's created. And we talked about it earlier, but this is tier 0. There's no debate. It has to have the ability to get changes and get changes all over the directory, which gives you the DC sync attack. But that actually can't be broken because you're syncing the directory to Azure. Really important thing that most people don't look at is is that service account and where's that computer object nested within your OU structure. Why that matters is because where it exists in your OU structure, you could be having people inheriting privileges over that. So we very commonly see an Azure sync server that will be nested under, like, let's say the server's OU, and then maybe some, like that might be segmented further. But the organization is given access for people to control the server's OU. But like the administrator level of Active Directory probably doesn't want somebody with server administrator access to have basically full control over the directory, which is what they could give themselves with OU control or with ACE control over a server that's nested under an OU that they control. That applies to the service account and it applies to the computer object. The service account is actually usually at least we've seen it recently where the service account, like those inherited privileges are disabled by default, but the computer object doesn't have that. And then within the computer object, who has local admin rights? So this goes, further even than the ACEs. Here's a good article from Trimark, again, Sean Metcalf, and their team on securing that Azure AD Connect and just kind of talking through some of those scenarios. But we see this very often. So again, people think that they have a good grasp because they think domain admins, domain controllers, but then they kind of, easy paths just start forming when you have ADFS, Azure AD Connect, again, GPO administration tools and servers, PAM. So all of these might be nested in different areas that are not protected by admin SD holder and might be administrative or have administrative control by somebody outside of who you want to have administrative control. Here's an example of what OU structuring looks like in Bloodhound. So we kind of give that visual depiction. Usually just seeing this visually, like you can see here that a lot of principles are located in a lot of different areas. So these are all tier 0 principles. On the right side, you see these little diamonds. It's indicating a tier 0 principle. And then this is showing kind of the, I'll say, haphazard way that these are thrown into the OU structure. So again, you need to understand everybody who might have rights over each of these OUs and make sure that that makes sense within your environment. Now on OU structuring, a lot of people have talked about how you can do this better. So we released a post, I want to say almost a couple of years ago now, where we talked about establishing boundaries for Azure and on-prem AD and how you might do that in your OU structure. There's another example that was then done by the same person on our team and Alex Schmidt at Teal Consulting at Troopers. That was the talk that I was referencing earlier. They talked and provided some tools on how you could structure this within your environment. So again, just trying to split your OU structure and make sure that you're blocking inheritance as it should be blocked for those tier 0 devices that may not be protected by default by admin SD holder. So recap. So this again was an amalgamation of some content that we put in a couple different forums. If you're interested in those tier 0 webinars, again, we popped the link, I think, saw that come through, which is awesome. talked about the history of that secure enterprise access model and why it's important to understand what tier 0 is for your environment beyond those kind of understood principles like domain admins and domain controllers. And wow, I just noticed that I have an extra N here on identify. Um, so identify, the reason why you want to do that is because you want to identify key ways that those that tier 0 tier could be broken. So starting first with the most basic, are you nesting groups under tier 0 groups, as you should not? Tier 0 users that have access to basically everything in your environment, where are they logging in? And should you be controlling for that? And then finally, where are your tier 0 principals housed within your OU structure? And who is inheriting privileges that you may not be comfortable with over those assets? So the recommendation here is just start from the most basic, right? I mean, nested groups is kind of an easy one. Why is somebody nesting under tier 0? Should you be creating a specific standalone group with delegated permissions over exactly what they need? Login activity. Why are some people logging in? And a lot of times, again, I showed two different examples of there may be just like a domain admin or a service account that you may be unaware of that is kind of spraying their credentials everywhere because they're conducting some, upgrade service or backup service. Again, being aware of that and shutting that down, especially in those kind of like script-based or automated, interactions, can have a huge impact on your security posture. Just fixing that one account, you don't have to go heavy-handed and make sure all domain admins have, like you should eventually get there, but start with the lowest hanging fruit. And then again, making sure like, if you're going to thinking about putting an OU structure in place, how can you do that safely for your environment? But again, this is based on priority and difficulty. So you got to figure out the balance of like what can you do now versus what is going to be a larger project, and what is the risk presented by kind of every iteration of these 3 attack paths. I will say that we don't like to, um, uh, you can use all of this material for your directory without any product. I will say that this is why we created Bloodhound Enterprise, to identify tier 0 assets across your environment at scale. So again, any number of forests or domains, we identify and pull out those tier 0 assets, and then continuously map attack paths and show how you could shut those down. Now, you don't have to have the enterprise product to get started. You can download the free and open source Bloodhound Community Edition and join the Slack community and get started now. Beyond Bloodhound, there are other open source tools that can kind of give you visibility into some of these attack paths as well. I obviously know most about these two, so I'm going to talk about this one. But the important thing is understand where these gaps can kind of come up and take action on them. Questions? Eddie, I only saw one come through, so.
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, we only had one in the chat. I don't think that you guys are able to come off of mute, but if you have any questions, oh, Victor, just let me see. You want to just drop your. I think you should be able to speak, Victor, if you have a question now.
Huzzah. All right. That'll be easier than typing. So
Yeah.
you mentioned picking off your lowest hanging fruit first for remediating these attack paths. Is there any sort of consideration to operational changes that you would have to make as well? I don't know, just considering impact of these changes versus just pick the easiest ones, or why not prioritize the most necessary, the most exposed places first?
Yeah, so I say it's a balance. Like you can't do one without the other. So you have to consider the risk that it's presenting, and then you have to consider like how easy can I do this, or like what's my path going to be? Like if I said most of the time in most environments, privileged access logins is the single worst scenario that people have. But trying to get people to change their behavior, so trying to get all of your administrators to use different systems, fully implement a privileged access management solution and understand the residual risk, that just takes a long time. It could take like a year. But if you identify that you have some like backup service, that again, that was literally a week for that customer to change. And again, like they found it through Bloodhound Enterprise, but they didn't have to. So that's just understanding the privileged users that exist and where they're logging in. They found the service account that happened to be a domain admin that was doing backups, and it was doing it through an interactive or type 3 logon. So and it's funny because as soon as the user brought it to that backup organization, they said, "Oh yeah, that's like 4 years outdated. You should use this type of setup." So that's what I mean. Like that was a big risk. Did they have other users that were logging in? Yeah, but it was like onesie twosies. It was not really that big of a deal. But that one backup service, like that took them a week to fix and had massive improvements for the security environment. So like, another way of saying this is like if you move around your OU structure, you will almost certainly break things, right? So you have to have a consideration for that before you do it. That's why I talk about like group nesting first and then going down lower and lower and lower. If you talk about like the operational considerations for removing like the domain users group from the domain admins group, like that's almost like a who cares what breaks, like you need to remove that right away. That's awful. That's everybody in the directory. Oh, hey, Jim's here. Sorry, I just know that Jim Sikora from Trimark's here. Hey guys. Yeah, Jim for references, those guys are great, and they're in our Slack. They're all around the community. So yeah, listen to Jim as well. I hope that answered your question, Victor. Like you have to consider both. You can't do one because it's a big security problem without understanding how long could it take you to do that. That doesn't mean you don't take any action. You just may be able to do something first. I think the biggest thing that I've found, and maybe Jim could talk on his or at least comment on his experience here. You have to take some action first. So take some small action and prove that you can shut down a single attack path. And then it gets a lot easier to kind of build on that momentum over time. I think people get like buried in the weeds and don't, might look at it's like you can only eat an elephant one bite at a time, if that makes any sense.
One bite at a time. Yeah. I use that all the time.
Yeah. Tim. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Fuad.
No, I was gonna read the Curtis question. Oh, well, this goes to a different question. Mentioned change auditor, but then, do you recommend protecting just the tier 0, or should there be protection policies in place for tier 1 and tier 2 admins?
I would recommend both, but I will say that there's really no sense in looking at tier 1 and tier 2 unless you have tier 0 controlled. So I feel like this is kind of one of those boiling the ocean things. Like if you don't start somewhere and get that done, then you can look at the entire thing and think, wow, we're never going to do that. So like if I was to tell you right now that you need to do tier 0, 1, and 2, that might just be like, oh my gosh, that's so much work. And it can be, but you need to start first and foremost with tier 0. Once you get that done, then move there, move on. So yeah. Hopefully that answers your question. Should there be protection policies in place? Absolutely. Should you do it before you do tier 0? Absolutely not.
There was another question about the differences. What kind of limitations are on an open source version? I guess it's about Bloodhound. That's my guess.
Yeah, that's so limitations on open source. There's a link on our website that talks about the differences between the open source version and the enterprise version. I'll say broadly that the open source version is built for pen testers and red teamers, and the enterprise version is built more for defenders and administrators. So two different use cases, kind of built for two different reasons. But yeah, I could go on and on and on just about that. I'll try to drop the link that explains the answer to that question more thoroughly.
Justin, do you see that link, dead link for the community?
Oh, whoops. Okay, let me get you a different link. I'll get you that before we end here. This is the feature comparison. Real quick on the feature comparison, like the top three like differentiators that enterprise has over the community is like enterprise is enterprise, so it's like it's 24/7 with an SLA and continuously monitoring. Number two, it maps every attack path and then prioritizes the choke points that you should fix. And then number three, it supplies you with the remediation information to actually fix those. The open source version has none of that. On the join the blood. Sorry, go ahead, Fuad.
No, sorry, we have another question from Heather. So you mentioned logging onto DC directly for administration. What about using a dedicated admin server, one where you'd log in as EA, one for tier 1 access, or would it be better to always log in with tier 1 access and do a run as for EA? This is in relation to sessions cred abuse.
Yeah. Ooh, that's a great question. It's hard to give you a, like, this is one of those, it may depend on your environment, and honestly, like the privilege access, listen to Jim here too, but I've seen multiple ways of handling this in customer environments. So like I've seen the concept of a jump host, like a dedicated admin server where you then log in to there. I think as long as you're aware of the residual risk around either setup and you control for that. So what I mean by that is I've seen jump hosts that, you know, people log into and then jump from there, but that jump host itself was controllable by basically everybody in the environment. Jim puts his I'm just reading Jim's response here too.
Yeah, it's basically saying the same thing, like it becomes a tier 0 then, yeah.
Yeah, I was actually going to hit on what Jim just said here too. Enterprise admins, I don't know why you would ever use that for things like enterprise admins is like that's the heaviest hammer. That's like the Thor hammer of hammers, right? To do something. So maybe that was just a specific example where you actually needed enterprise admins, but like you know, hopefully like going down the levels, like maybe domain admin and then some lower level admin. Yeah, that what Jim just said. Any other questions?
I think that's it.
Awesome. Well, I'll pass it over to Katie here, but I will make my own plug for TEC. For those that were at the experts conference, it was great seeing you. I remember meeting you, Victor. Actually, like the conversations at TEC are awesome. I mean, Jim, I don't think you were there, but we had multiple people from Trimark were there, multiple people from SpectraOps were there. I'm gonna Brian from Ravenswood and his team were there. All of the experts at Quest, which I mean they've forgotten more than most have learned in Active Directory. It's honestly like where us as, I guess, experts in the field would love to converse with other experts, and the customer interactions, can't say enough good things about this event. Active Directory and, you know, Azure and Office 365, which is, you know, kind of the cornerstone of this event, from my opinion, is that it doesn't have a really dedicated event outside of TEC. You know, it's the backbone of identities for 95% of organizations today, and parts of Active Directory Office 365, Azure are talked about kind of inadvertently because people always abuse it and then deploy ransomware at other conferences. But this is the only one that focused directly on that and is kind of built for administrators and security professionals looking at these three kind of components. Anything more you want to say on that, Katie?
Actually, I was gonna say something, Justin. Thank you for your input. That was a great plug. But yeah, TEC is coming up, Dallas, Texas next year. Not gonna be in Atlanta. So make sure you get your tickets. They're live now, so you can head over to the expertsconference.com and grab those.
And then you got this, Jacob?
Yep. And then lastly, don't forget to tune on to our next Tech Talk in 2024. It's going to be top 10 actions to take in your team's migration with Randy Rempel and Sofia Serna Perez. This will be January 9th at 11 a.m. Eastern. Don't want to miss this one. This was also a tech topic at Tech Atlanta 2023, so this was a pretty good one. Thanks everybody again just for joining and sitting in on Justin. Justin was a great session.
Thanks everybody, and if looking to continue the conversation again. Before I leave, I'm going to find the link to that Bloodhound Slack. But thanks all for joining, and I'll find that link and drop it here in a second. I'll stop sharing for now. You can probably stop recording.
I will stop recording, but I'm going to hold off here because I think the chat is only good until we end this session. So I want to make sure to keep it live until you find that.
Yeah, it won't be hard.